Hello, my name's Ivan, and in this tutorial we're going to cover how to do triggers in our timeline. Now, trigger is a type of event, and it works slightly different to what triggers work like in Unity. If you're familiar with those, this has a different purpose, a different intention, but it is a trigger nonetheless. So I'm going to start by going to my timeline in this previously configured scene, like I mentioned in every tutorial. To learn how to configure your scene and your characters and do all the required setup, please watch the other tutorial link below. Otherwise, you can just go and load the Interaction Manager example, and it will have a scene configured for you to test. So let's head back to timeline. I'll leave the console here right open. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my event types. In event, I'm going to select trigger, and I am going to add a trigger event. So like always, a trigger gets added into this timeline. Always remember not to rename this. And in this case, the trigger opens up, has its event ID like anything else, and it may or may not have an agent. Now, triggers are the only events that may or may not have an agent. What's the difference? Well, if you do have an agent, the only way you can get this trigger to run by going sequentially through this is if you're within range and looking at the character specified here. So if I drag, Taima, then I would only be able to execute whatever this trigger does if I'm looking at her and I'm within range. For now, you can look in Taima and her status manager that I am in range and I am looking at her, but that's just because I have my scene set up that way. For the most part, though, usually you want to execute triggers regardless of this, right? So what's a potential use for triggers? Let's say you want to tint the screen a different color, move an object in the scene, I don't know, shake the screen, all sorts of things. These are things that don't require a character or the elements within the character. So for now, I'm going to leave it empty. Now, the component is the actual script that has a code that you want to execute. And so for this scene, I'm going to go to a trigger test script that I have right here. Now you might be tempted to, drag the script directly and edit. This is not going to work because the component has to be part of a game object. Now, linked below are a couple of tutorials on game objects and components and, basic Unity use. But if you're already slightly familiar with this, I'm going to create, I'm going to do a 3D object, a 3D cube. And really quickly in my scene, I'm just going to make it huge, and move it into a visible spot. You'll see why in a second. This is not required. It can be an empty game object or anything else. But for now, I'm just going to use a cube, a very obvious cube. I'm going to turn off the mesh render so that I can see, through it. And this cube, I'm going to name it trigger object. So this is the object that it's going to have my trigger. Now, in this case, I'm going to drag the trigger test and put it into this game object. Whoops, didn't do it. Yeah, here we go. So I have a trigger test right here. Now, if you remember the trigger here, it's asking for a component. So what is a component in Unity? Well, it's basically every single one of these things. The transform, the mesh filter, box collider, mesh renderer, and it includes our script. So basically we need to drag and drop this script from this object directly into here. Now, the problem is that when you try to do that, every time you select this to try to grab this, well, it changes the screen and you can no longer do it. Fortunately for us, the interface is completely flexible, so I can open another inspector, which is what I'm going to do by right-clicking here, add tab, and then add another inspector. Now, you can also drag things around, configure them. I'm just going to put one next to the other. So now I have two inspectors. But the next thing I have to do is to lock one, the one from the trigger, so that it doesn't change. So now in this inspector I have the component that I want to run, and in the other one I have the trigger object here. So I'm going to drag this component, put it here. Alright, so there's just two more steps. Now we know what script we're running, but we don't know what method, right? So if we go into trigger test, which you can see the code here, this is just a trigger test. It's an example. It just has a method called change color, but it could have a variety of methods, and you need to specify which method you want to call. Now I can call change color, and then within change color I can call any other methods, but I need to specify the entry point. So I'm just going to copy change color for now, go back to Unity. I no longer need this inspector, I just need it to drag and drop. So I'm going to unlock this and go back to my trigger. And the method that I want to call is change color. Now finally, I can specify parameters if I want. So in this case, I'm going to put 3 parameters. If we go back and look again at the code, we receive a string array of parameters. This is really important. Every method that you want to call through a trigger can only receive an array of strings. So if you need integers, floating points, any other basic primitive type, you have to typecast it once you're inside your method. For now, this is, as you can see, it only has a simple loop that will basically just print all the parameters. And if I go back here, I'm going to put red, green, green, and blue. Alright, so if I run my code as it is, let's just play it. Event index 0, which is trigger, and it's printing red, green, and blue. Now, this is different than the triggers in Unity. So, for example, remember the trigger object that we had here? This huge cube has this convenient box collider, right? So, if you're familiar with triggers in Unity, you can use this to do a lot more complex stuff. For example, let's say I want to do an actual Unity trigger. So what's an example of that? So let me do real quick this method right here. So this is a Unity trigger. Unity triggers work slightly different, right? While the timeline triggers, the ones for this system, work sequentially, so between dialogues, animations, responses, and so depending on what you respond, you can trigger or not trigger something. For example, Unity triggers are usually based on collision, right? For example, is trigger and a box collider right here. So you can even do Unity triggers from the timeline triggers if you wanted to. One way to do that is, for example, this trigger object, I can disable the box collider so that no matter who touches this box, it's never going to run whatever Unity code there is. And this is useful for, having locked doors that you open at a later time after you talk to certain characters, or, having thunder flashing on the screen when you cross a certain threshold, whatever you want to do, but you might not want them active all the time. So one way of doing that is I'm going to go back to my code, and here we would do some stuff. And my trigger here, what I could actually do instead of changing color or whatever, I can go to the game object that has this script, which is the cube, and then I can get a component. There are a lot of components I can get. In this case, I'm going to get the box collider, and then I'm going to set it to enable. Now with this, and I'm going to save, always remember to save your scripts. So now this trigger object has a box collider disabled, but when I play it, there it goes. It's enabled, and it's still printing red, green, and blue because that's what the code was meant to do. So you can see how triggers can be very flexible. They can do a lot of things for you. And again, the main difference between this triggers and this triggers, like Unity triggers, timeline triggers are executed in the timeline. So they can branch depending on responses, memory checks, emotion checks, all sorts of things, while the triggers in Unity are usually working from collisions of different types. And that's it for triggers.